This episode is brought to you by Snapple. Want to know another Snapple fact? The first hot air balloon passengers were a sheep, a duck, and a rooster. Ridiculous. Check out Snapple.com to find ridiculously flavored Snapple near you.
Hey, Holly.
Hey, Dave.
What's going on?
How are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderfully, I guess. That's
an adverb.
Yeah, I know. I'm a little nervous because I have an editor who's listening in right now, and he's probably he's making notes already. This is wonderful. We have Dylan Jones with us. And Holly, please tell us about Sir Dylan Jones.
Dylan Jones is the editor-in-chief of British GQ, where he's been since 1999. He is the author of many, many books, the latest of which is Sweet Dreams, the story of the new romantics, which is what we're going to talk about today, and maybe a little bit more. So welcome, Dylan Jones. Do we call you sir?
I think so.
Nice.
Because you are officially an officer of the Order of the British Empire, correct?
No more suffice, but you're very kind. Thank you.
What does that entail? You get a wonderful medal, but then what do you get? What are your perks? What are your club perks?
Literally none.
Oh,
I had my previous agent, who sadly died. He was from New York, Rhodes Scholar, and he was made a CBE because he spent most of his life in the UK. Big literary agent, Ed Victor. And he called me up one morning and said, Dylan, I know you have an honor, and I just got this honor, and tell me, how do you use it? And I said, well, I don't like it when other people use it, but I never use it. And this obviously wasn't the answer he wanted. And he asked this question sort of like 3 or 4 times. You put it on your business card, you put it on your email, I don't use it. And he said, and after a while, as was his habit, he said, Dylan, you've been really helpful. I'm going to use it on everything.
Why not? I mean, that's it. I mean, or you could be like, that was the award that John Lennon famously threw into the river. Is that?
He only got an MBE. I'm just saying.
Oh, you rank higher than the Beatles. Nice.
Sure, had he still been with us, he would have been knighted. But I just finished writing a piece about John Lennon to celebrate his birthday. It would have been his 80th birthday on October the 9th. And I was writing about going to the Ghost building about 25 years ago and to have tea with Yoko Ono. And I was trying to remember, A, what it looked like, and B, the feeling, the sensation of being in someone's house like that. When the ghost of them was still there. It was an extraordinary afternoon. Very privileged to have been there.
Mm. And I'm sure there are many more stories like that.
And actually, you don't mention that in the book. In this book, which is Sweet Dreams, 1975 to 1985. There's no mention of John Lennon in the book, if I remember correctly. What was the impact at that time for you personally?
Well, in fact, I mentioned this in the piece. I mean, it's invidious to say so, but he kind of died at the wrong time because even though it was a terrible tragedy, he wasn't at his creative peak, because when Double Fantasy came out, which was the record that came out about 3 weeks before he was murdered, it actually was a critical bomb. And actually, even though people revere it now, people didn't like it when it was released. The reviews were awful. And actually, it was only after he died that the record became such a huge hit. So actually, culturally, John Lennon wasn't particularly, I mean, it sounds sacrilegious to say so, but he wasn't actually culturally important at the time.
Wow.
I shouldn't have.
No, that's a good take. But you're going to lose your medal for saying that, but that's all right.
Lost already.
Okay, so 1975, that's where we start in this book. And I'm curious myself about why I get the beginning with punk, but how did you choose 1975 as the place to start this book?
Well, it's a period. This period is a period that has been done a huge injustice, I think, by pop historians and cultural historians. There are hundreds of books about punk, books about country and western, about Britpop, about hip hop, about every genre of music, but there are almost no books about this period. And I think that this period has been demonized by many people. And when people look back upon the 80s, they do it with the tongue in their cheek, and they laugh at the fashions, and they say it was a period of shrill, brittle pop music. And they talk about the decade of style over content and about how MTV drove everything. And so I wanted to kind of try and rescue it, I suppose, and try and do it some justice, because I think it was a fantastic period for pop music, and also it was a very bohemian period as well. I think that has many reverberations in culture today. But I started in 75 because that was the sort of birth of it, in terms of the people who were first going to punk clubs, people who were still going to soul clubs, and that was the sort of genesis of it. And then I ended it in 85 because that was, I suppose, the natural conclusion of the success of all the groups that came out of that new romantic period. And they sort of passed the baton on to a different generation, an older generation of stars.
So you specifically said in the book, or maybe it was one of the interview subjects, that the term New Romantics wasn't embraced by those that were considered New Romantics, yet punks always, embraced punks. They called themselves punks. What was it about the New Romantic title that they didn't find themselves latching onto?
Well, the original title was, there was a piece in a magazine that said that this is the cult with no name. And actually, all the people involved in it, they sort of hated the idea of being defined. In fact, even though they were New Romantics, when I came to title the book, I almost didn't want to use the term New Romantic, because I think a lot of people find it off-putting. They think of people with silly haircuts, wearing lots of makeup, cross-dressing. They think of it in a kind of pantomime, fancy dress way, I suppose. And again, I think the term New Romantic has become a bit of a pejorative. It's, if you are dressing up as a New Romantic, you're silly, So as I say, I was trying to rescue it from the idea that it was just a sort of fancy dress parade.
That's good to hear, and I think you did with the book. And it's funny. I mean, just our background. Obviously, we grew up. We're roughly the same age, and we grew up with this music. But we grew up in Los Angeles. This happens to be our favorite, or my probably maybe even more so than Dave, period of music. 80s, early 80s. So it was interesting to hear more background, because the term New Romantic never conjured up anything negative to me as a listener and a fan of the music, but it identified them. It identified some of the artists to me. But it was really great to hear more of the background, the clubs, because we only knew the music. We didn't know the scene. We knew the LA music scene and the rock scene, but we didn't know anything about that scene behind the music we loved. So that's just why we found this particularly interesting. You gave us you colored in everything for us.
Well, I think one of the reasons, tell me, this is an idea, a theory that I have, and you can agree with it or contradict me, but I think one of the reasons that the principal groups of the New Romantic time, the big pop groups that were involved in the second British invasion in 1983, when 3/4 of the American charts were taken over by British pop groups, I think that one of the reasons, why they were successful in America, and they were critically more positive about the groups in America than they were in the UK, is that all of these people wanted to be successful. If you were a punk, or you were involved in punk, it was all about ideology. The ideology was more important than the music. And to say you wanted to be successful was sort of anathema. How on earth could you want to be successful? You've got to strive to be an artist. And actually, most of the people involved in this time, in this world, in this genre, they wanted to be pop stars. They wanted to be successful. They were fiercely proud of the music they were making, and they made some extraordinary music, but they wanted to be successful. You weren't allowed to want to be successful in the UK at the time. It's weird. Is that true?
Yeah.
So, yes or
yes. So I think it's a little of both. Of course, there was MTV, and And the Brits were way ahead of us as far as making videos. You know, as you mentioned in your book, there wasn't a lot of product. There wasn't a lot of artists in America that were making videos. They didn't know what to do with it. You know, we had the, you know, famously, video killed the radio star. I remember, you know, the artist Billy Squier trying to make a video, and he's prancing around, and as you watch this video, you could literally see his career disappear in the 3 minutes that song is going on. But the Brits knew exactly what they made it glamorous. You know, Duran Duran and Adam Ant. It was almost this fantasy world, and you know, it just captured America's attention. And we were also lucky in living in LA that we had this radio station KROQ. They were digging through these crates of albums and going through, buying the imports, discovering them, finding out what was being played in the UK and playing it in LA, getting attention. So that was also huge.
It was everything coalesced for us. But it's funny. In hindsight, it's easier to analyze this. You talk about these artists that came over and they wanted to be pop stars. We see nothing. We embraced that. We embraced, you know, and we added to it. I mean, we added fuel to that fire, obviously, because they had, you know, those that became, you know, so Wham and Duran Duran and those. They had the presence, they had the sound, they had the music, they had everything. And we embraced that. And I couldn't see any reason why they wouldn't. I understand the punk ethos, but why wouldn't you want to become a pop star? Why wouldn't that be part of your whole want, your whole desire? I mean, I can't imagine, you know, why it wouldn't, but I understand now. And of course, reading the individual stories like, you know, Alison Moyet, who, you know, I'm a huge fan, didn't necessarily want to be up there in front of people. But Dave, your perception?
Yeah. I mean, I think earlier, you know, to break into America, I think a lot of Brits didn't realize how big America is. You know, the Sex Pistols maybe hit 5 towns during their U.S. tour. They had a great promoter. But, you know, again, with MTV, you could just, if you get played and you look great, you got our attention. And that was certainly the case.
I was going to talk about because I think if you look at there are some records, but I mean, if you look at sort of Bruce Springsteen videos from the early 80s now, they kind of look ridiculous because they had to make a video. And those records, you close your eyes and listen to the music, it's extraordinary. And it's so synonymous with the time, but it almost transcends the time because they are classic records. But then you look at a video like for Duran Duran's Rio, and the song is synonymous with the video is synonymous with the song. You can't really hear the song without seeing the video, and that's like a perfect encapsulation of that period. And I think that video is fantastic because it's a comedy sort of extravaganza, fantastic aspiration of being successful and having a fantastic time. But they were vilified for that in this country because we had miners' strikes, we had the Falklands War, and if you were there was very much a sense that in the music press at the time, which was kind of left of center, there's no way you were sort of allowed to make music unless it was political, or unless your ideology dovetailed with left-wing political thinking. So a lot of these people were demonized as being sort of right-wing or Thatcherite. But apart from Gary Newman, who was openly a conservative, the Tory, I would imagine pretty much everyone else involved in the scene was left-leaning. But of course, that didn't fit with what the music press, like the melody maker and sounds, wanted to understand.
That's a hard, even thinking about it today and music being made today and, you know, art being made today with everything that's going on here in I guess everywhere, but specifically in the U.S. We like to separate our art from our politics, but it's inevitable. It's going to cross over. I guess the same thing, you know, the same themes carry on, you know, through the ages.
Yeah. As you touched on, even with, with George Michael and Boy George, they didn't want to proclaim their sexuality. They kind of knew what was in the U.S. you can't talk about that. You had to have a separate, the Boy George character, the George Michael character, and then the real person. So I think they understood that back in the day. That they have to separate.
The whole role play thing is fascinating because you had I think it's quite a complex sort of sexuality that this music had, because on the one hand you had very obvious visual representations of men looking like women looking like men. You've got Annie Lennox, who is very masculine. You've got Boy George, who is deliberately feminine. Then you had, as you say, very, very successful pop stars who were household names, like George Michael and Boy George, who were very coy about their sexuality, and in George Michael's case, deliberately obtuse. And yet, on the other hand, I think that it did become a great platform for sort of sexual freedom, I think. And by the time you get to Frankie Goes to Hollywood, you have a sense that the two principal people in Frankie Goes to Hollywood are so obviously sort of out there and gay. And it's a really sort of positive message. And that's why I think that this is it was a very bohemian period, and lots of people who came out of that period in London principally went on to have extraordinary careers and, in a sense, helped define the culture, I think, in dance, in music, in video, in film, journalism, in literature, all over, I think.
All right, still talking with Dylan Jones, author of Sweet Dreams, From Club Culture to Style Culture, the story of the New Romantics. We will be right back.
Welcome back to the What Difference Does It Make podcast and our special guest, Dylan Jones. I wanted to ask you, this is a total aside, but ask you a question about Boy George in the book. I mean, we know him, we've known him since we've known of him and about him since the 80s and some of his history, but didn't know that he was considered an intimidating figure.
Oh God! In the before he became a pop star, when he became a pop star, obviously, as you know, he was very funny. He was camp. He was sort of an outrageous-looking person, and yet he was loved by teenage girls, and he became a sort of national hero. He's like the Queen Mother. Walking around London in the late 70s and going to clubs and seeing George, he was a really intimidating, imposing person, because he was this huge, tall drag queen walking around with a yellow face and spiky hair, very bitchy, very catty. And actually, he was very intimidating, very intimidating. It seems crazy to talk about it now, but in 1978, 1979, if you saw Boy George on the street, it was quite something. It was like, whoa, okay,
And I loved reading about how he finessed a little through the years. I guess his first performance or live performance, he was cursing at the audience or cursing, and parents had brought their kids to see him, and so he kind of, I wouldn't say refined himself necessarily over the years, but learned.
Yeah, I think that a lot of those groups were conforming to the ideas of what a pop group should be, and they had acts. They were presenting themselves, and I think that people talk about authenticity a lot in pop music, and I like Neil Tennant's view on this, as that he thinks authenticity is a style like anything else. I'm going to be authentic. But I do honestly think that apart from that great period in the 60s, between probably 64 and 68, I think that this period is probably the greatest period for British pop music, for singles. I think there was such a vast array of fantastically varied, brilliant pop singles in this sort of period, say 79 to 83, 84. And if the 70s was the decade of the album, I definitely think that the 80s, or at least this part of the 80s, was a decade of the single.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because it does sometimes get the short end of the stick. I think the 80s, that people don't take them these artists as seriously as they should have.
Yeah, right.
All right. So you talk about authenticity. I guess this also goes to you. Where you started going to the club scene. This is your story as well. You have you're a Blitz Kid. Can you talk a little bit about how you dressed, what you look like, what the feelings that you felt going in there and seeing, maybe bumping, having to deal with Boy George at the coat room, or what? How old were you when you first started clubbing?
I was 18 when I first started clubbing in 1978, and I spent 10 years in nightclubs, which is probably far too long, but not continually. I wasn't particularly extravagantly dressed at all, but it was an intoxicating period because I was at St. Martin's, which was the art school, which was, I suppose, the sort of nucleus of all of this. Most of the principal people involved in the Blitz scene went to St. Martin's. I'd say at least 50% of them did, maybe more, on the fashion course or on the graphics course or on the painting course. And there was a real sense of excitement in London. It was post-punk. I mean, these days, everybody goes to university. Literally everybody goes to university. In those days, people didn't go to university, so going to art school was a very particular thing, and you felt quite special. And I have to say that there was, and I don't know where this arrogance came from, but I think we were quite arrogant people, and I think we had this sense of entitlement about us. Not the kind of entitlement that millennials have now, which is a different kind of entitlement. We did feel that we were quite special, and I really don't know where this arrogance came from, but it was certainly there. And when I was one of the early editors of ID magazine, and there were three very important magazines at the time. There was ID, The Face, and Blitz, and they all launched in the space of 3 months in the 80s, and they were the original style magazines. They were prisms through which the world saw what was happening in London, and then the UK, and then the world and culture at large. And I have to say that we definitely thought, and again, I don't know where this arrogance came from, but we definitely thought that as well as reporting on the culture, as well as mirroring the culture, that we were part of the culture itself. We very much felt that. And in hindsight, I think we were, but in our own small way. But it did feel very, very intoxicating because you felt like you were part of something. You felt like you were part of a scene.
Was it trying to get through Steve Strange, or what was that process like? The gatekeeper, I guess. What was he looking for, and what was his I mean, you got into it in the book, but yeah, touch on that.
I mean, for people who don't know Steve Strange's story, I mean, it was the Blitz at the time was pretty much in the UK that was the first club where people took over a nightclub for one night and invited all their friends in and played a particular type of music. I mean, for young people today, there's nothing extraordinary about that because the world is full of nightclubs and dance music. But in London at the time, nightclubs were for old people, unless you were into soul music, and there were lots of soul clubs. And if you were into to rock music or pop music, you went to see concerts. There weren't really interesting nightclubs. And then the Billies started, then the Blitz, and then they all sort of started mushrooming around London and mushrooming around the country. But Steve Strange was the doorman of the Blitz, and he was a very formidable character, working for Wales, very extravagantly dressed, and he used to stand on the door and said yes, no, yes, no, yes, and a lot of people found that very intimidating. In fact, Mick Jagger turned up having had dinner somewhere, maybe at the Zanzibar or something. He turns up in his training shoes and his jeans and his nylon jacket, and Steve Strange said, I'm not letting you in. And that was quite a big deal at the time. I mean, it seems farcical that that's a cultural moment, but it was quite a big deal at the time. Although famously Bowie came once, and of course Bowie was largely responsible for the whole scene because most of the principal architects of the Blitz scene were Bowie kids. All of us revered David Bowie. We'd fallen in love with Ziggy Stardust, and we sort of carried that with us, really.
That's definitely the running theme throughout the book, is everyone's passion for Bowie.
Yeah, that was the through line. I guess, with the Beatles, everyone started up a band. How did Bowie influence your personal style?
Well, I've written 2 books on Bowie, and my first book on Bowie was about his appearance on Top of the Pops, big TV show in the 70s, when he came on and played Starman. And this, at the time, this was such a generational moment. Top of the Pops at the time was watched by about 12 million people, which would have been about 25% of the population. Massive show. I mean, when TV was big. And it's a real rite of passage for people of my generation. Saw David Bowie playing Starman, and it kind of changed our lives. And I remember the last time I had a sort of long conversation with my father before he died was in 2011. And he came to stay at Christmas, and he said, "What are you working on at the moment? Are you working on any books?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm working on this project. I'm working on this book, which is about David Bowie's appearance on Top of the Pops in 1972 and what it meant to the culture and how it kick-started all of these little sort of rivulets of culture and how it influenced so much." And I described the amazing music, I described the color of his hair, what he was wearing, the lights, the whole thing. And my father let me wang on for ages talking about this. And then he very quietly said, "You do realize we had a black and white television at the time." It sort of fed into it afterwards. But it was a very important moment. And I was 12 at the time, and people responded in many different ways. Some people started dressing like Bowie. Some people wanted to go and see Bowie in concert. Some people wanted to buy all his records. What I wanted to do was have hair like David Bowie. And so I summoned up the courage to call around various, what in those days were called unisex hair salons. Those hair salons that would cut men and women's hair in the same place, which was still a kind of freaky idea at the time. And I called a few of them and said, "I want to have my hair like David Bowie," and most of them didn't know what I was talking about, and one did. And I made an appointment to go and see them. So I had a photo. So the Saturday afterwards, so in about 10 days after this show, on a Saturday, I go into this hair salon. I'm 12 years old, and I got a photograph of David Bowie. And I said, "I'd like to look like that, please." And the hairdresser just looked at me and looked at my floppy hair, because I had long, lank hair, and he said, "Absolutely no way can I give you hair like this." And I was really disappointed, but I didn't want to leave without something. So actually, I left that day looking like Dave Hill, the guitarist in Slade, who had sort of like cropped hair and long hair. And the weird thing is, when I read Boy George's autobiography that came out about 20 years ago, he had exactly the same experience. Exactly the same experience.
That's great.
That was my attempt to look like David Bowie. But Bowie did have a huge effect on people. Huge effect. Yeah. And I think, obviously, he became a very important artist. And I think one of the few people from this world who you could say was touched with genius. I honestly think that David Bowie is the Picasso of this world. I think he was an extraordinary artist. But he did have long tentacles, and the sort of the reverberations of David Bowie and what he did to the culture, specifically with style and music, was very influential for this period, for the sort of Sweet Dreams, New Romantic period.
The other through line is Brian Ferry that you touched on, which I didn't really realize the impact he had in the UK and how important he was. Please explain why it was Bowie and Brian Ferry that meant so much to the youth.
Well, Brian Ferry, again, I think that the early Roxy Music albums were as revered as the early David Bowie albums in the 70s. For Your Pleasure and Stranded and Country Life, they were real touchstone records, because he was fusing that idea of sort of future retro style with hard rock. It really resonated with people. And then when he started performing solo, his thing was he wanted to be sophisticated, both in himself and in the way he portrayed himself in his art, in the way that he would photograph his album covers the way he appeared on stage. It was about looking like Gary Cooper or Cary Grant. It was all about dressing up in tuxedos and with smoking jackets and being photographed by swimming pools with models. And he was a working class guy from Newcastle. And this was sheer aspiration. And I think for lots of working class and lower middle class people like myself, he looked at Brian Ferry and went, wow, I want that. Mm-hmm. I want to be sophisticated. I want to be in that world. It was a much narrower seam of influence than Bowie, but it was just as important. And I quote a friend of mine in the book called Fiona Dealey, who the book is dedicated to. And she describes going to a Brian Ferry concert at the Royal Albert Hall and looking up and seeing what she thought was a sort of VIP box and thinking to herself, that's what I want. That's what I want. And actually, that sort of lust, driving for sophistication and an idea of a sort of moneyed world was definitely something which drove this scene. And I think that Brian Ferry became sort of less influential the older he became and as he came into the 80s for two reasons. A, because the music became so refined that it ceased to have a sort of cultural impact. And secondly, I think because he was such a traditionalist, because he basically wanted to be an English country gent, he wanted to be part of the aristocracy, that his idea of sophistication became sort of old-fashioned to a group of people who were in their 20s, who had been exposed to lots of different types of sophistication and were perhaps already slightly more culturally sophisticated than Brian Ferry was.
Well, you mentioned, in the 80s, that you had a couple quotes, like there was a quote saying, all you needed is a tape recorder and a microphone to create some music. And that's what it became. Or, like someone who else was talking about, this artist was laughing that, there were artists trying to learn 3 chords. All I needed was 1 finger. Suddenly music is changing.
I think that if you think that if the Sex Pistols were the sort of lodestar for the punk generation, then Kraftwerk were probably the lodestar for this generation. There was actually a real sort of punk element to a lot of this music, particularly the synth bands, the synth duos, because you're right, instead of learning 3 chords and bashing out a punk song, they were buying computers and trying to make music that way. And of course, I think people always forget that musical ambition is always married by talent. So the music you're making is a combination of what you want it to sound like and what you're actually able to make it sound like. And that's where the interesting tension is, I think.
You talked a little bit about the tension between David Bowie and Gary Newman. Bowie's almost hatred of Gary Newman and how awful he was to him. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Bowie found Gary Newman preposterous. He thought he was a total ham and a sham. And I think he hated the way that Newman had taken on the sort of visual tropes of Bowie and was sort of copying him, but in a really sort of like Woolworths way, a sort of really tacky down market way. I mean, there is an album cover of Gary Newman's, I can't remember what it's called, might be called The Pleasure Principle. I can't remember. I didn't particularly like his music, and he's staring at a small metallic pyramid, and it's so sort of pretentious. It just does. It's literally meaningless. And I think that you can take images like that, and you can take the Vienna video for Ultravox and see a lot of meaningless sort of staring into the distance. People being very sort of tortured because they have something on the horizon, or they're wearing makeup and they're going like this, and it's so I think there are sort of ludicrous moments, and I think they're sort of crystallized in Gary Newman. I think Gary Newman made some very good records. Yeah, very good records. Our Friends Electric is a kind of masterpiece, but I think he was derided by lots of people because he didn't come across very well in interviews. I think because he was quite serious, that he sort of fell between the sort of black and white weekly music press and the sort of color style press. He wasn't good enough for either, really. And he was he was treated quite badly, but he was treated spectacularly badly by Bowie. Bowie even banned him from appearing on the same television once, which I thought was rather brutal.
I think the fact that he has Asperger's is obviously contributes to his maybe discomfort in public. But I feel like he also, because he seems to be, my perception is that more respected now.
Oh, completely. And actually, I interviewed him for the book, and he was an absolute joy. And I think that you're completely right. I think that the Asperger's made it very difficult for him to connect with people and with media. But of course, in those days, he didn't talk about things like that.
Yeah. Brings me to another point. Another favorite quote from Andrew Ridgeley saying, like, we had nothing to rebel against. So, we made fun music. And if everything is going well, Wham kind of reflected the times, obviously. Or was it? Or was it?
They were an interesting conundrum because, as you know, George Michael needed Andrew Ridgeley to be Wham. George was the real talent, but he needed Andrew Ridgeley's confidence, Andrew Ridgeley's good looks, Andrew Ridgeley's ability to charm, to dance, to be it's a sort of front man in a way. And it took a while for George Michael to get the confidence to step out and have a career by himself. But he would not have been successful without Andrew Ridgeley. And I think both of them, they were a bit younger and they didn't really get punk. They thought it was a bit silly, a bit aggressive. They're the prime example of a group in this world who wanted to be very, very successful. And they were both talented. I mean, George was an incredibly talented songwriter and obviously turned into a very mature songwriter. But the way that pivoted, the way that the springboard was as a very popular, almost like a boy band, I suppose, but a boy band created by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously very popular, but underrated as artists at the time.
There was a time when Wham came back after a sort of 6 months break, I think they've been touring with Wake Me Up Before You Go Go. Lots of people went, ugh, this is suddenly too poppy, but we loved it. We embraced it. We kind of got it. Mm-hmm. We knew what they were doing. I remember going to the final, which is the big gig they did at Wembley Stadium after they were splitting up and George was going solo. And I wasn't exactly the sort of quintessential demographic because I was a 26-year-old man, but we had a fantastic time. They were great.
We have to mention Malcolm McLaren, a manager who's kind of orchestrating a lot in the 70s and kind of had, I don't know, was he a puppet master or was he, what was the sauce for Malcolm and Vivienne Westwood and the sex shop? How important was that?
He was incredibly important, and he was a puppet master, and he was responsible for creating the Sex Pistols. He was responsible for Bow Wow Wow. He was responsible for the look of Adam Ant. I mean, Adam Ant was a struggling ex-punk who hired Malcolm McLaren to give him a sort of overhaul. He gave him £1,000, and McLaren said, "Look at the tape of Gary Glitter and Burundi drumming, and I think you look like a pirate. Thank you very much. Put the money there. I'll be off. And by the way, I'll also steal your group, turn them into Bow Wow Wow, and hire a 14-year-old, I think, Malaysian girl to front them." So he was an integral part of the scene as well, although he obviously predates it because he was a shopkeeper with his partner, Vivienne Westwood, and obviously was responsible for the Sex Pistols and then went on to have a very successful solo career as well. Fascinating man. I interviewed him once. I interviewed him many times, but I interviewed him once in a sushi bar at the Kensington Hilton in 1987. And we were drinking beer, and he just split up with Lauren Hutton, and we were drinking a lot of beer. At one point, I had to go to the loo. Karen was going, "Well, man," yes, he was like talking. And I had to go to the loo, and because it was in a hotel, a round trip would have probably been about 7-8 minutes, maybe a bit longer. And when I transcribed the tape the following day, he hadn't stopped talking into this tape recorder, as oblivious to the fact that I wasn't there, talking about how much he loved Vivienne Westwood and all of this stuff. It was crazy, but he was a real character.
That says a lot about him, actually, that he continued to talk.
Nick Rhodes says once he saw Adam Ant dressed as a pirate that the new romantic scene was dead. And so he went immediately and got some Anthony Price suits. That established the look for Duran Duran.
Yeah, I mean, they were, along with Spandau, they were the sort of quintessential band of the moment. And there was incredible rivalry between them. Duran Duran, again, were derided for a lot of their music. But I think a lot of their songs, they make fantastic pop music. And they look great. As Anthony Price suits, they look terrific.
Yes.
Holly agrees. I agree. I mean, I think that was almost distracting. Is that they were so good looking, but yet they were making these perfect pop songs and it's great music for someone like an LA guy. Whose sister was loving them and had their posters up. It's like I don't think I should like this band, but yet I did. I found them immensely interesting.
Great pop.
Yeah, that's funny that we cared about it at the time. What it says about you, that you like them. And Dave and I, we've discussed this on previous podcasts, what it says about you. Who cares? Music is art and it's personal, and who cares about the reasons you like Duran Duran? If you think they're great and they make great videos, or if you just like Simon Le Bon's voice,
Which is why I say that one of the reasons I wanted to write a book was to try and almost reclaim them. It sounds pretentious, but it's a lot of that music was very, very good.
Well, we agree. You came to the right place to say that.
Yeah.
I'm in door here, aren't I? That's good. That's good.
It's actually the whole reason we started this podcast.
Yeah.
No, but it's brilliant. I think that the 80s, I mean, as you know yourself, maybe better than I do. It's there was a phase about 15 years ago in the UK for lots of programs that were about, the crazy 80s. And it was always focusing on rah-rah skirts and Duran Duran and Boy George's makeup. But that's changing now. And I think that what happened to the 70s is now happening to the 80s. There was a period when the 70s was always called the decade that taste forgot. And then after a while, the 80s became the decade that taste forgot. But I think it is being reclaimed culturally, because I think that with distance, people understand the importance of the sort of narrative arc of that period.
Your book culminates almost like with Live Aid. All of a sudden, it's all these artists together in one place and putting that all together. Is that the way you envisioned it, or in a way?
I wanted to finish with 1985 because I do think it's a full stop, because I think that a lot of the excitement and the dynamism from that period had dissipated, but some very, very popular pop groups came out of it, and many of them appeared at Live Aid, particularly the British part of Live Aid at Wembley Stadium. And I was at that concert. I wrote a book about it. But I think that for me, the interesting thing was that most of the acts at the beginning of the day, the early part of the day, were the likes of Spandau Ballet, Howard Jones, Nick Kershaw, Adam Ant, a lot of people who'd come out of that scene. And then towards the evening, you had these sort of rock behemoths like The Who, Queen, Elton John, Bowie, U2. And I think that there was a lot of people who were at the concert, a lot of people watching on television around the world, suddenly thought to themselves, you know what, I really like Queen, I really like Elton John, I really like Paul McCartney, I really like The Who. These people who had huge careers in the 70s, who all perhaps had sort of wandered off from. And after that period, after that event, suddenly it was all about the big stars. Everybody wanted to play stadiums. Prince came and played Wembley Arena. Madonna came to play Wembley Stadium. Michael Jackson came to play Wembley Stadium. It was all about playing stadiums. Everybody wanted to play stadiums. And it was almost like a switch. And a lot of the artists, those younger artists, the Adam Ants and the Spandaus as well, didn't really have big hits after that. For me, it seemed like a natural end. It was a natural end to the period, and it was a natural end to the book.
It's a great read. Highly recommend for anybody who's a fan of the era in any regard. It was really, really a great read.
You're very kind. Thank you very much indeed.
Before we wrap it up, you mentioned every band needed a killer emotional ballad. What is your favorite killer emotional ballad?
Careless Whisper.
Very good. And why is that?
Because I think at the time, no one expected George Michael to be able to write as such a heartfelt, emotional, powerful song. It's a really powerful melody. It's got extraordinary lyrics. It's got a great saxophone break, beautifully produced. It's a fantastic ballad, and it still works today, 36 years later.
I don't know if I would put Careless Whisper above All of My Heart, but I understand.
You're a very bad woman. I'm not talking to you again.
Wow. Okay. Well, we'll have done that.
Okay. We can edit that out, and then will you come back?
You captured this moment in time, this 10-year period, 1975 to 1985. Dylan Jones, Sweet Dreams, From Club Culture to Style Culture, the story of the new romantics. And it's a great read. It was wonderful. One of the highlights is you put a discography at the end of it, and that's going to be a playlist that I'm going to be making. It's really nice to there'll be something to go through. I mean, like your book, it's a very hefty and a lot to get through. But I look forward to revisiting a lot of these songs, and it was kind of nice to revisit that time, that period that I wasn't quite a part of, but then grew into, as I got older, and just a lot of fun to read and reminisce and think about.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, guys. And it's been really good talking to you. Thank you, guys.
All right. Sir Dylan Jones, everybody. So how about that talk with Sir Dylan Jones? That was kind of cool.
That was fantastic, and I could have spoken to him forever. It's so many questions, so much information about the 80s and all of our favorite artists. So thank you to Dylan Jones for writing the book and for being a guest on our podcast.
Again, the book is Sweet Dreams, From Club Culture to Style Culture, the story of the new romantics. Big thank you to Becky Kramer at Faber & Faber / Cursive Communications, who hooked us up with Dylan Jones. Really appreciate that. Wonderful, wonderful book, wonderful read. And also check us out on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter.
And YouTube, by the way. And you can check us out on our website, wddimpodcast.com. What Difference Does It Make is a proud member of the Pantheon podcast family.
Spectacular. Okay, so until next time, this is Dave.
This is Holly.
Check you later.
Over and out.